Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to this video where in this one, I'm going to be showing you how to build out a full stack application using Appwrite and React. So this video is meant to be like our Appwrite React quick start guide where we're going to see how to build out a backend with Appwrite, front end with React, and we're going to see how these two work together and make that connection. So we'll do this by building out a notes application or more so of a to-do app where we'll learn how to perform basic CRUD operations with our Appwrite database and see how we can interact with that. And then we'll even go as far as adding in user authentication to see how we can create protected routes and only allow logged in users to perform these operations. We're going to be building this project out completely from scratch, but before we get started, I want to talk about some of the assumptions that I'm going to make and some of the prerequisites that you should have. So first of all, I'm going to assume you have a little bit of React knowledge. If you don't have any React knowledge, maybe you're coming from a different front-end framework, you should still be able to follow along. Just know that I'm not going to explain every single concept along the way, but you should still be able to code and really make sense of what's happening. A lot of it is going to be self-explanatory. Now, if you're completely new to Appwrite, this video is actually going to be a good place to start for you because while we're not going over the full what is Appwrite overview process, you're going to be able to see all of this in action as we set up a fresh project and actually start building with Appwrite. So you really just get to see it in action right away. We are going to be using Vite to set up our React application. So make sure you have Node.js installed and also make sure you check out the source code linked up in the video description. I would highly recommend you download that and check it out before you get started. So that way you have a reference point and anywhere you get stuck in the application, you can always just reference the source code, see what we're trying to build and maybe just copy some code if you need it. And also there are going to be some assets in there like our CSS file that we're actually going to copy and paste from when we're building out our application. So a few things we need from there. So make sure you also check that out. Again, it's linked up in the video description. Okay, so to get started, first thing we're going to do is set up our React application. We're going to clean up some of that boilerplate code, add some basic page routing, and then we're going to go into our Appwrite backend, set things up there, and then start connecting that to our React application and start making those requests. So we have a little bit of cleanup to do here. So I'm going to use Vite to create this. So we're going to call npm create Vite, and I'm going to call my application to do, finish up these basic prompts here. We'll select React and then JavaScript for that. Now from here, I'm just going to go ahead and go into VS Code. We'll open up the application that we just created, which is on my desktop. And I'm just going to complete the process by running all those installs. So we're just going to run npm install from VS Code now. And let's just go into my source folder. And inside of app.css, I'm just going to go ahead and remove all of that. And I'm also going to remove all of my CSS inside of index.css. So later on, we're going to add our own CSS. So I want to make sure that's just cleaned up. And let's go ahead and just get rid of everything inside of app.jsx. So everything from that closing p tag to that opening div right here. And we're just going to set up our basic page routing now. So let's get rid of our state here. Let's get rid of all of these imports. And from here, I'm just going to say home, open up our terminal and run npm run dev. Okay, so that's opened up on port 5173. And here's my application. That's exactly what we need. So from this point on, what I'm going to do is just add some basic page routing. So I just want to create our home page where we're going to call that notes. And then we want to create a login and register page. So we're going to have two pages inside of our application. So what I need to do is go ahead and turn off my server and clear this out and run npm install react router DOM. And once that's installed, I can make some imports here. So we'll just import browser router from React router DOM. Then we also want to import routes and route like that. And I'm also going to need to make some pages. So before we actually start setting this up, we're going to create a new folder here. And this is going to be called pages. And then we're going to create a page called notes.jsx. And in here, I'm just going to go ahead and create the component. And if you haven't seen this before, this is just an extension that I can use where I can type in this short code and it's going to generate that component for me. So if you go into VS Code, into extensions, start typing in ES7, you're going to get this extension right here. So it's ES7 React Redux GraphQL code snippets. Essentially, there's a bunch of little shortcuts that you can use where we're able to just generate components, make imports, and so on. So that's what I'm going to be using throughout this tutorial. So inside of pages, we're also going to want to create a login register page. So login register.jsx, and we're going to do the same thing, React arrow function component export, and that's going to create that for me. So we have our two pages, and inside of app.jsx, I can just go ahead and actually create that routing system here. So what I'm going to do is replace these fragments with browser router, and I'm going to create my routes in here. So first we're going to wrap everything inside of the routes component. Then we're going to create a route component, and in here, this is where we're going to pass in the actual pages that we just created. So I need to import my note page and my login register page. So the first one here is going to be notes. Close that off here, and we need to set the path. That's going to be just the root directory right there. So we're just going to put a /, and then for the second route, this is going to be the login register page. So we'll throw that component in, close that off, and then for the actual path, we're just going to send a user to log in like that. And let me just minimize this. Let's see that all of this is working, and then we can go into setting up our backend. So we're going to run npm run dev, and we'll give this a test. Let me refresh this. So now we see notes instead of home, and if I go to login, we should see that other component. So page routing is ready to go. Now for the Appwrite side of things, let's go ahead and get started by going to appwrite.io. If you don't have an account, go ahead and create an account. It's free to do so. So go ahead and create an account, and we're going to start everything off from our console. So in my console here, once this gets loaded, we're just going to go ahead and create a new project. So I'm going to call this to do app, or just call it to do like that. And this is going to generate a project ID for me. So it's starting to set up my credentials, and we'll just continue from here. So we'll choose our region, hit create. So once your project's created, this is going to be the interface to your entire backend. So from your Appwrite console, we have our auth tab to manage our users. We can manage our database, documents, and collections from here. We can write custom functions, handle file storage. So really your entire backend all in one place, managed by Appwrite. Now, what we want to do here is go ahead and connect to our SDK here. So we want to tell Appwrite which SDK we're going to use and actually connect it to our front end. Now, from here, inside of the overview tab, this is where we select the SDK that we want to use. So we're going to select web here, and we first need to register a host name. So where are we going to connect to our backend from? So we're going to connect to this from local host. So we want to make sure we specify this, because if we try to use our SDK without specifying our host name, we're going to get a CORS error, and Appwrite essentially is going to block this request. This is for security reasons. So we want to set this and make sure that wherever we're porting in from, we have that. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this my app. It doesn't really matter at this point. And we're going to click next, and we're just going to follow the setup instructions here. So I'm going to install Appwrite. So we're going to copy this to clipboard, and we're going to run this installation. So I'll turn off my server and clear this so we have space, and run npm install Appwrite. Now the next step here is to go ahead and set up our client instance right here. So we're going to copy that, and I'm going to put all of this inside of the source folder, and I'm going to create a new file inside of the Appwrite folder /config. So we're going to create a new file called appwriteconfig.js here, and this is where all Appwrite configuration is going to be. So we'll just go ahead and paste that in, and from this point on, let's just go ahead and hit next. We're going to grab this right here. So we're going to copy that to clipboard, and we'll paste this in right here. So this is our client instance, and this is what we need to connect to our backend. So here we specify our project ID and the endpoint that we're going to connect to. We did that with the client class right here. And the project ID, if we ever happen to lose this, we can actually get this from our console. So let's just go ahead and hit next, continue this process. If we ever need to find this, this is going to be in the overview tab right here. This is the project ID if we ever need it again. So we still have some more basic configuration that we need to handle between our backend and our front end. But before we do that, I want to make sure that we have a database set up, because that's going to be the first request that we actually make, is to get some data out of this Appwrite database. So we'll go to the databases tab here, and I'm going to create a new database, and I'm going to call this dev for development. And for the database ID, I'm going to leave that empty. So Appwrite will generate one for me. And once we have a database, we're going to create a collection or a table. So Appwrite is technically a relational database. So we're just going to call this tasks for our collection. And it's also going to create a collection ID. So we're going to create that. And once we have a collection, the next thing we need to do is go ahead and set up our database schema here. So we're going to add in some attributes here. And the first attribute I'm going to add is going to be a string value. So that's going to be the attribute type. And this will be the body of the actual node or task that we create. And I'm going to set a max length of 200 characters. We'll hit create. So we have our body attribute, and I'm going to create one more, and this is going to be a Boolean type, or a type of Boolean, and we're going to set this to completed. So a note or a task will either be completed or not. It'll be true or false. So we're going to set the default value to false because when we first create it, a task is not completed. And we're going to add in some data here. So we have our two attributes, and we're going to go to documents now, and let's go ahead and create these. So for this first one, I'm just going to say first note, and the default value is going to be false here. So we'll set that, and we're just going to add another one here, and this is going to be wash car, and we're going to say this task was completed, just so when we render these out, these look different. Okay, so we have two documents here inside of this collection, and this next step right here is very important. So inside of our collection here, we're going to go into the settings tab, and we need to set the permissions. So the permissions right here is basically saying who can make requests to this specific collection and what kind of permissions do they have. So under the permissions tab right here, we're going to say that any user, regardless of whether they're authenticated or not, can create, read, update, and delete to this specific collection. Now in the future, we're going to change this so only authenticated users can create documents. Then we're going to set document level permissions so only a user can see their own documents and actually modify them. But for now, we're just leaving it like this, and you have to remember to make sure you complete this step, make sure you hit update, and make sure that that was actually updated, because a lot of people forget this step right here and then run into an annoying error where it basically says a user is not allowed to make this request. So very critical part of this entire process. So now that we've completed our database setup, we can complete the configuration part from the React front end. So inside of my config file here, what I'm going to do is bring in the databases class, and this allows us to connect to our database. And we're just going to go ahead and set this up right here inside of a variable called databases. We're going to call new and then use that class right here and then pass in the client instance right there. Now I'm also just going to go ahead and export this so we can actually use client and databases anywhere we need. And before we make our request, I'm going to create an env file to make sure we actually hide all of this information that we need. So our project ID, our endpoint, and then later on, we're going to need our database ID and collection ID. We want to make sure that's put into its own file and then not pushed up into our GitHub repo whenever we want to do that in the future. So I'm going to call this file .env, and inside of Vite, we need to make sure that all these variables start with Vite, and the first one's going to be my endpoint here. And we're going to set that to this endpoint. So I'm going to grab this right here. We'll paste it in. And then I want my project ID. So Vite project _ ID. And we can get that from here. Set that up here. And I also want my database ID. So database _ ID. And the database ID, I can just go back into my databases right here. Databases tab, we'll grab this one. Throw that in, and then we also want our collection ID. So Vite collection _ ID _ tasks. So we can have multiple collections. So I want to make sure to specify specifically what collection I need. And this is the tasks collection, and I'm going to throw that in right here. Now to actually bring this in and use it, we're going to save this. We'll go into config.js. So I can just update these to import.meta. env and then the actual variable name, so Vite _ endpoint, and then we'll just copy this and we'll throw in the project ID. Let's throw that in right here, and this is going to be project _ ID. Okay, so that completes it for our basic configuration. Now what we're going to do is actually get to the fun part and make a request to our backend and retrieve those notes that we have here. So we want to render those out inside of this notes page here. So inside of this component right now, we don't have anything. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and just make some basic imports. We're going to bring in use effect to initialize everything, and then use state to actually set our note state in here. And we're going to go ahead and create a function called init. And this function is going to initialize everything that happens in this component. So this is going to be an async function. We're going to use an arrow function in here. And to actually initialize this, we're going to go ahead and import databases. So not the databases class, but the databases instance that we just set up from our Appwrite config folder. And we're going to make this request once init is called. So we're just going to go ahead and set response to await. And this is going to be equal to databases dot list documents. So that's the method that we use to actually make a request to our backend. And this method right here at a minimum requires 2 parameters, and that's going to be the database ID and the collection ID. So we need to know what database are we making this request to and what collection do we want to make this request to as well. So let's go ahead and actually get those. So those are set inside of our .env file right here. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and copy the collection ID or the variable name to that. And we're just going to import first our database ID. So import meta.env. And then this is going to be database underscore ID. And we also need to pass in the collection ID. So these 2 parameters are crucial for this. And this is going to be meta.env. And then I'm going to paste that in. So our collection tasks right here. And I just noticed we keep calling this notes and tasks. We keep messing this up. Or I keep messing it up. So what I'm going to do here is just go ahead and change this to notes right here. And I'm going to change this inside of the env file as well. And I'm just going to rename the entire collection name just because it's going to be easier to rename the collection instead of having to change up different things inside of our application. So let's go into settings for this collection. And I'm going to call this notes just for some consistency. Okay, so little side tangent there, but I wanted to get that done. And we just made this request. So init right here is not triggered. We just made the function. So before we actually call it, what I want to do is go ahead and create some state and put some state in this component and then update the state. So we have our notes here and then our setter method to update the notes, which by default are going to be an empty array. So that's the default state right here. Once we call init, we're going to make this request. In this response right now, we get back 2 values. So we're going to get back the total amount of notes returned, and then we're also going to get an array of all the documents inside of that collection. So we want the response documents array right there. So we're going to set notes to be that new array that we just got back. Now we want to go ahead and initialize this. So we actually want to call it. So we're going to call use effect. We only want to trigger this on the first render. So for that, I'm going to pass in an empty dependency array right here. And then I'm going to call init to make sure this is called right away. Okay, so I'm going to save this. And what I'm going to do here is also create a wrapper around all of my notes. And then we can iterate through this array and actually render the notes out. So let's go ahead and call notes.map. And for each note here, we're going to call this function. And we actually want to render this out here. So we're going to create a div for each note like a container. And by default in React, anytime we're looping through an array like this, we need to make sure we have a key. And this needs to be unique. So we're going to set this to the note ID like that. And then we'll pass in the note body. So note.body. And I also realize I need to fix this import. So this needs to start with a vt and then underscore database underscore ID. Okay, so let's save this and give this a test. And here we see our first notes. So if you completed this, congratulations, you've successfully connected an Appwrite backend with a React frontend, and we see it all working together now. So if you go to your Appwrite backend, whatever notes you have back here, you should see rendered out here. So the next thing we're gonna do is go ahead and actually optimize these requests a little bit just for more cleaner code. So right now we're about to add in a create form so we can add notes. We're gonna handle some update and delete functionality so we can modify these notes, mark them as complete. But we are using the Appwrite core SDK just as it is right now. And what I want to do is create some wrappers around these methods just to make this code look a little bit cleaner. So right now we have to call the method, then we pass in the database ID and collection ID every single time we make this request. And I want to do something that looks a little bit like this. So I want to access the database, then I want to access the collection that I'm requesting by its name, and then be able to just call a method like this. So I just want to be able to list out notes, maybe create notes like that. And something like this would be a lot cleaner than what I have here. Now, I do have a full video on this topic, and I'm going to make sure it's linked up and also pops up on the screen that actually explains all of this. But instead of going into that, what I'm going to do is actually go into the source code that we have and just copy that code directly and then just explain a little bit. So the code that we need is going to be in the source folder right here. And within the source folder, we're going into the Appwrite folder and we're going into databases.js. And I'm just going to copy all of this right here. So let's go ahead and hit copy to clipboard right there. And I'm going to bring this into my code here. So within the Appwrite folder, I'm going to create that same file name. So databases.js. and we're going to paste this in, and I'm just going to summarize this real quick. But again, I highly recommend you watch that video. So let me try to explain here. So originally we're calling the databases instance directly within one of our pages or a component. And what we want to do is we want to abstract this away and call this instance right here from the databases.js file. So what we're doing here is we're importing databases from the config file into databases.js, and then we're going to create a class here that we're going to reference the database by. Now it's an empty object, so what we're going to do here is also set our collection information. And you notice that right here, this is an object, so in the future, we can have multiple collections here. And we're just attaching all the information to each collection. So we want to specify the database ID that's related to that collection, then the actual collection ID, and then in the future, let's say we had a collection like products here, we would update this to the products database ID, then the products here, and we have the information related to each collection. Now, once we specify that information, what we're going to do is we're going to iterate through the collections array, and we're going to attach all this collection information to this DB instance right here, or this object. And how we start this is on each iteration, we start by looping through the collection, and then we go into the DB object, and then we set a key here. So that's the first part of this process. The key is going to be the name right here, which is going to be notes, and that's that human readable name. So we set db.notes. So at this point, you can call db.notes. That's the first part. Then we go ahead and attach this object to notes here. So we're doing this essentially right here, and we're adding these methods right here. So once we add it, we have the create method, update, delete, list, and get. So these are like those built-in Appwrite methods. And all we're doing is simplifying this process by wrapping them. And then we call the original method right here. So this is where we call databases.createDocument. And we simply call this when we call create, but instead of having to pass in this ID right here for the database, then for the notes, we simply set that on initiation right here. And then we pass in any other values like the payload, the permission, and a custom ID if we want to pass that in. So if we want to look at the simpler example where we call list right here, so I'm going to create some space just so we can see it. We call list, and this just returns a function that really just returns the list documents method with these values passed in. So that's the core idea right here. So once we save this, this is already exported. So we can just call DB from now on. So I'll go into the notes page here, and I'm going to remove databases. So we don't need that import anymore. And for now, I'm just going to comment this out, and we're going to import DB from Appwrite/databases. And now we can just call const response. So we're going to do the same thing here. This is going to be await, and we can just call db.notes.list. So we're just calling this method right here. And from now on, we're going to use these methods right here from this page or from this file. Now, when we call this, if I save this, it's going to do the same thing that we had before. So if I refresh it, we still see all of our notes once that loads in, and there we go. So that's all we do. We can just clean this up. And that's a lot cleaner. Now I don't have to remember the collection ID or the database ID. I can just call the notes by this readable name, which we set right here. So what we're going to do now is create a form to actually add items to our database from the front end here. So we're going to go ahead and create a new component that's going to be brought into this notes page right here. So the form component is going to have its own logic, and then we're going to import it just to make sure everything's cleaner. So what I'm going to do here is create a new folder called components. And within components, we're going to add a form. So note form.jsx. And this is going to handle all that logic. So we're going to go ahead and create the actual component itself. And let's build this out before we actually import it. So we're going to create the form here. And in the form, we want to make sure we have an input, and the type is going to be of text. We want to give it a name. This is going to be equal to body. So the input name is body, so we can actually reference that once we need to get it. And then we also want a placeholder. And I'm going to make sure the form is actually closed off, or the input tag. And for this placeholder, because I have an emoji in there, I'm just going to go to the source code here, and we're going to go ahead and just copy and paste that here. So we're going into components, note form, and we can just copy that right there. I know not everyone knows how to use these emojis, so if we just copy and paste that, that's going to work just fine. So now it says what's on the agenda. We're going to make sure this is in double quotes because we have a single quote right here. So we need to make sure we can actually have that set. And that is our note form. So let's bring that in to our notes page before we actually use it, and just to make sure we can see it. So import note form. We'll bring that just above our notes div right here. So note form, close that off. And we're also going to pass in this set notes setter method right here, because once we add a note, we actually want to update this state right here. So we're going to set that and pass in the prop. So we pass in set notes, and then from note form, we're going to go ahead and just get set notes. Okay, let's just see if we have everything like we need here. And we see our form, so that looks good. We can continue on adding that logic. So within our note form component here, I'm going to create a function called handle add. And this function is going to be responsible for everything that happens whenever that form is actually submitted here. So I'm going to go ahead and add in the event listener. So on submit here, we're just going to call handle add. Now within handle add, first thing I want to do is prevent the default behavior. So e.prevent default, because we want to take care of everything that happens. We don't want the form just to do its normal thing. And we want to go ahead and get the value within the body right here. So the body input field. So we're going to call this note body, and this is going to be e.target.body.value. So we're getting the value of this input field. And from here, we just want to write a try catch here. So we're going to try to send a request to the backend. If it doesn't work, we're going to catch that and just console out the error here. So we're going to start with that, and we'll do console.error, and that'll just be the error message. Now within our try statement is where we're going to make that request. So we need to import db from Appwrite/databases, and we're going to use that create method. But before we do that, we need to make sure this is an async function, and let's start the process here. So we're going to go ahead and call const response is going to be equal to await. Then we'll call db.notes.create, and we need to pass along some data. So we're going to take this note body right here, and I'm going to put this into a variable called payload. So const payload, and this is going to be equal to body, and we're sending the note body. So we're passing that along. We're throwing that into the create method. So within the create method, we're going to go ahead and send that when we call the create document method right here, and we can proceed from there. So the next thing to do would be to update the state. So we're going to call set notes right here, and we're going to take that previous state and then update it with a new array. So we're going to go ahead and use the spread operator, pass in the response here, and we're just going to throw along the old state here. So the new object gets added into that state. So let's just see how this works. Let's make sure it's actually being added. So we'll refresh everything. Let's go ahead and just say new note, hit enter, and we see our new note. So there's a few things that I want to fix here. So first of all, right now, you notice the form does not refresh. So I can just keep hitting new note or hit enter, and it just keeps adding it. So I want to reset that form. And then I can also submit this form if I have no values here. So I want to make sure that that gets prevented. And then also, whenever I refresh this, you notice that the original notes go to the top, and I want the new notes to be at the very top and then the older notes to be at the bottom. So we're going to take care of a little bit of housekeeping before we actually start going through the update and delete functionality. So within here, first of all, I want to reset the form. So we can just reset that after that's updated. So we can call e.target.reset, and that's going to reset that form. So that should take care of that part. And then right here, I want to make sure that if our note body is an empty string, so if note body is equal to an empty string, we don't want to submit this. We just want to go ahead and return, and that's going to stop the rest of this function from running. So it's not going to allow this to be submitted. So if I refresh that and hit enter, nothing's going to happen. Well, I guess I did have a value in here, but let's just say another note, submit that, and then that form is refreshed, and I can't submit it if I'm hitting enter from here. So now with a sorting issue, so first note should be down here. We can fix this inside of the notes page here. So inside of notes here, wherever we call db.notes.list, we're just going to import the query class and set how we want to order this. So we're going to call query, and this is going to be passed in right here as an array here. So we'll just create some indentation, and we're going to call query order descending. And we're just going to throw in the value or the attribute that we're going to sort by, and this is going to be created at like that. Okay, so if I save this, let's check this out. So we have a new note. If I say test here, hit enter. Now if I refresh this, test is going to be at the top exactly the way that we need it. So you can choose how you sort that and how we can arrange everything. So next, we're going to work on the update and delete functionality. So what we want to do is allow a user to actually click on a note. When they click on it, it's going to update the completed status to either true or false, and the completed note will be rendered out with a strike through for that text. And if it's not completed, it's just going to be a standard note. Now we'll put all of this into its own component, because now that we have delete and update functionality, or once we do add it, there's going to be a few functions in that component that need to actually handle this. The component will also have its own state. So we just want to make sure to separate that logic and not put everything into the notes page here. So let's go ahead and add in a new component here. And this is just going to be called note.jsx, and we'll create the component itself. And in here, we're going to pass in the note data here. So we're going to pass in this parameter called note data, and we'll just render out the note.body like that. So we'll pass that through, and then inside of the notes page, we're going to pass in the component and then render this out. And we'll add the logic in a second once this is set up. So inside of this loop right here, we'll just pass in the component. We'll also pass in the key, and that's going to be the note.id. And we're going to pass in the body as a parameter here. So we'll just go ahead and pass in, or not the body, but the data. This will be called note data, and that'll be the actual note. So now we can get rid of this, and if I save this, we should see the same output right here. So inside of this note component, the first thing I want to do is go ahead and give it its own state here. And the reason why we want to do this is anytime we click on a component to update it, we want the component updated without having to re-render the entire array. So the component should be able to manage its own completed or not completed state. So to do this, what we'll do here is just go ahead and set the note state. So we're going to do note and set note. And the default state will be given from the parent. So note data will be the initial state. And then we actually want to go ahead and just pass this down right here. And then the on-click events can be added from here. So what I'll do here is go ahead and create a span tag. And we're going to create a condition and say if a note is completed, then this note right here should be rendered out with a strike through. So we're going to say if the note's completed, use the strike tag right there, and we'll pass in the note.body. And I'm going to close this out right here so we have more space. And in the else condition after the strike, we're just going to say pass in an empty fragment, and then we'll say note.body like that. So when I save this, it should fix the indentation, and there we go. So if the note's completed, strike it out. If not, make sure it's a normal note. Now in here, I don't have any notes that have the completed value to be true. So I'm just going to go back into my database, and we'll say another note is completed. So we'll go to data. Let's change this value, and then we're going to update this from the front end in a second. So we'll set this to true, and let's see if this actually gets rendered out the right way. And that's what we wanted, a note with a strike through, so perfect. Now let's actually add in the update functionality. So let's go ahead and create a function called handle update, and this will be an async function here. And in here, we're going to update the actual note in the database and then update the state of this note. So we're going to pass this through right here. On click, we want to update the note. And in here, we're first going to go ahead and get the status of completed. So completed is going to be equal to the note, but the opposite of the current status of the completed state. So if completed is true, then completed will be false. And then if it's false, it'll be the opposite. So we're just alternating the state, and we're deriving that value from note.completed. And then from here, we can just go ahead and update the actual database. So we'll import db, and we're going to call db.notes.update, and the update function takes in the ID of the current note. So we're going to pass in note.id, and then the payload here, which we can just pass in as completed. So we're updating the completed attribute. Now from here, we also just want to go ahead and actually update our state. So we're going to say set note here, and we're going to take the old state and then update it with a new. And for this, we're going to pass in an object. And we're just going to update the status of completed with the new status of completed. So if I go ahead and save that, on click, we're going to update the database, update the state, and this should actually toggle that strike through functionality. So if I click on it, now we see the notes actually changing. And if I go ahead and refresh this, this is updating it in the actual database. So we're just going to go ahead and add in the delete functionality, and then we'll add in some styling so we actually have like a good hover effect just to make sure this all looks good like the app that you saw in the demo. So we'll build that in a second after we add in the delete functionality. So for the delete button, what we're going to do is go ahead and use an icon, and this is going to be in the source code that I provided linked up in the video description, and we're just going to copy this directly from here. So go into the source folder and go into assets right here, and we're going to delete icon, and we're just going to copy this entire component. So it's just an SVG file that I created into a React component, and we're going to bring that in here inside of assets, and we're going to bring in delete icon.jsx. And let's just paste this in here and then import it and use this within our component. So in the note component, we're going to import delete icon, and that's going to be from assets. And we're going to go into the delete icon file, and here is our icon. So once we have that, we're going to create some space here, and I'm going to create a div around it. And then we're going to throw the icon into the div. So delete icon and throw that in like that, save it. And let's just see that we actually have it. And here we go, that's our icon. So for the event handler, so for the actual event listener for the delete click, we're just gonna go ahead and build that in. So we're gonna add that just below handle update. And I'm gonna go ahead and call this handle delete. And we're also gonna make sure that this is an async function, and we're gonna use an arrow function. So we'll pass that in front of it. And we need to make sure to set that. And we're gonna add this in right here on this div right here. So on click, we want to make sure we actually call the function, and we're just going to go ahead and update our database. So we're going to call db.notes.delete, and all we need to do is pass in the note.id right here. So we're going to throw in the note ID, we're going to delete it, and then once that actually gets deleted, we want to make sure to update our state. So we're going to call set notes, and we want to make sure to update the entire notes array. So we're going to pass in set notes right here, set notes. And we're just going to pass this in from the parent component. So we're going to pass it as a prop so we can actually update the parent state, and we'll throw that in. Okay, so once a node is actually deleted, we just want to go ahead and get the current node and actually remove it. So we're going to update the state by calling set notes and then getting the previous state and then updating where we're currently at. So with the new array, as we filter this out, so we're going to take that previous state called .filter. And using the item ID, we're just going to go ahead and iterate through this and make sure that we actually remove the note here. So the front end is updated and the note that we just deleted is no longer in there. Okay, so once this is saved, I should be able to test this out. Let's go to our front end and let's just go ahead and remove these notes here. I'm clicking on them. They're being removed from the front end, but if I refresh it, now they're officially removed from the back end as well. So that's all in sync. Now, the next thing we're going to do is just go ahead and actually style this application and make sure it looks good. So for all the styles in this application, what we're going to do is just go ahead and reference the source code in that GitHub repo, and we're going to copy all the CSS over and then update all our pages and components with all the necessary IDs and class names. So we don't really need to know the contents of that actual CSS file. We're just going to paste it in, and then our styling will get updated. But I will do all of this with you so we can actually see exactly what we're pasting over. So the first thing we're going to do is go into the source folder, and we're going to grab the index.css file, and I'm going to copy all this CSS and then paste this into my index.css file. So make sure it's index.css and not app.css. So we have that, and our application is going to get updated a little bit. And the next thing I'll do is just go into the app.jsx file here, and we're just going to take the code from here. And again, the final source code does have more code than what we're currently going to have in here because it's the final project. But at this point, we're just going to go ahead and create these two divs and create one with the ID of app and one with the ID of container. So let's go ahead and just recreate that. And that's going to be an app.jsx. So we'll create both divs here and create the second one, take this browser router, and we're just going to throw this into the inner div. And this ID is going to need the ID of app. And then this one is going to be container. And let's just see this as we update. So that should center my items a little bit. So they're going to be more towards the center now because there is a max width on them. And let's go ahead and go into the actual note form and let's update this part now. So inside of our code here, we're going to go back into our components. Actually, what I'm going to do is go into nodes, and we're just going to update the notes page. So let's see what we need here. So in here, we have a container above our note. So we're just going to copy this right here. And then our note here looks the same as what we have here. So this is all we have in our current code right here. So we're just copying this div and then this h1 tag. And there is an icon here too, or an emoji, so we're just going to use that too. So that's going to make it a little bit easier. So inside of notes here, we're going to turn this into an empty fragment and then put this above the note form. Okay, so that's all we needed from the notes page, I believe. And that's going to update that right there. So we see that emoji. And then next we're going into that note form. So note form, we're going to go into the HTML part here. And in our source code, let's go ahead and grab components and note form. So this part's going to be a little bit redundant, but at least we know exactly how to follow along. So the only thing we need to do here is just provide the ID of to-do form right here. So if these values ever change, make sure you're referencing the source code and not just watching the video, because if I happen to change this to like notes form instead of to-do form, then you're going to have an issue if you're following along directly without actually referencing it. So in here, we're going to throw that right here, and we'll see the output. That makes our form look a little bit better. And now we want to update the actual notes here. So we'll go back here, we'll go into components, note, and within the note, we need to create the class name of wrapper. So we'll throw that in. And that's going to be in the note component and around the main div. So we'll paste that in. And then in here, we just need the class name of note body. We'll copy that. And that's in the span tag here. So we'll paste that in right here. And that should do it for our styling. So now we have the hover effect. Now as we add new notes, we'll just do 1, hit enter, 2, and those are updated. We can delete it so we see the hover effect over both. We can update and actually strike through, delete them, and everything's looking good. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next one, we're going to handle user registration, authentication, and protected routes. So make sure you're subscribed to the Appwrite YouTube channel so you don't miss it, and I'll see you all in the next video.